Hi, this is Dr. Kimberley Linert, and you're listening to Incredible Life Creator Podcast. My guest today is Michael Banks. Michael Banks is an educator, a leadership development expert, a writer, a podcaster, and a public storyteller. Welcome to the podcast, Michael.
Thank you, Kimberley. Pleased to be here.
Yes, and that is a very short bio that you sent me, because I know from looking at the rest of what you sent me is that your bio includes a whole lot more than that.
It does. I think I once went to a fortune teller or a psychic when I was in my mid-20s, and he told me that my life would have many different chapters. And I often think about that because it's true. I've had a number of significantly different chapters throughout my life.
Mm-hmm. So just so people can get to know you, why don't you start out with, where you grew up, how you started out, and maybe you can touch on some of those chapters so we can understand, who you are and where you're coming from.
All right. Okay. So I started out in a little boring suburb of London in the county of Surrey. And I was packed off to boarding school when I was 11 years old. Surrey in England, obviously I sound English. I am English, although I'm actually now an American citizen as well. So I was packed off to boarding school at the age of 11. And in those days, it was a typical English public school. So I don't know why they call them public schools, because they're completely private, exclusive. You've got to have a lot of money to typically to send your kids to those institutions. In those days, we're talking about the late 60s, you still had fagging. And fagging was where you had to get up even earlier than normal and go to the prefect's room and put on the toast, polish his shoes. We're talking all boys here.
Oh, goodness.
Clean the show. They used to call it a show. God knows why. But anyway, I had to clean the show. And if you happen to fag for a good prefect, a nice prefect, you're okay. But some prefects could be brutal. And in those days, there I was, 50 miles away from home. And in those days, the English system was such for private education that you were kept away from your parents for the first semester. The reason is that it was to build your backbone. Just insane. I was just traumatized. Forget about building backbones, but to be away from your parents for 3 months initially without seeing them, without being allowed to see them, it was very tough. So the English boarding school experience was really difficult for me. A lot of bullying and teasing. And I remember standing at the age of 13, I stood in the junior common room in the middle of the room. And I was on my own. It was lunch break or something. There was no one else around. I was just crying, but I was angry. I remember saying to myself, it doesn't have to be like this. The world does not have to be like this. You don't have to suffer, and you don't have to treat people with cruelty and so on. I think that's where I started my sort of life's journey, really, which is ever since I've been on a mission to make the world a better place, to use that cliche. So English boarding school. And then I graduated, went to university, studied education because I was a left-wing anti-capitalist, and the only thing I could think of was to be a teacher. Well, I studied English literature for my undergraduate, then a postgraduate in education. And I went straight from that. I fell in love. I was actually going to teach 18 to 21-year-old Thai women how to speak English in the northern part of Thailand. The equivalent is like voluntary service overseas, which is like the American equivalent is, what's that thing where you go away for 2 years, you take time off and you do social work or whatever it is in another country. Anyway, I didn't end up teaching 18 to 21-year-old Thai women at the age of 22. I didn't do that. I fell in love, decided to stay in England, in London, lived with this art student who was there in London, and wondered what the hell I was going to do. So I ended up running an adventure playground, working with criminalized Jamaican youth. in the worst part of London at the time, Peckham. It was the largest low-rise, high-density estate in Europe. It had been up for 10 years and it was already a slum. It was very scary. In those days, they didn't have guns, but they had knives. And so my community center, if you like, was a place of last resort for all those kids who were running from the parents and police and so on. So I had to exercise incredible relational, emotional intelligence skills before anyone had ever heard of emotional intelligence. And I had to do that to protect myself. From the age of 22 to 25, that's what I was doing, was running this center, giving these youth and these kids a place to be with adults who weren't trying to put them away or put them down. So that's what I did then. And then at the age of 25, I had a transformational experience. I left what I was doing. It was like every morning I would go to work and I'd have this sort of like twist in my stomach because it was so scary.
Yeah.
And I feared, even though I got along really well, I had a protection racket going. My car was the only car that was parked outside the center that was never vandalized or broken into.
Mm-hmm.
If something got stolen from the adventure playground, the oldest one, Wayne, who was 21, would come up to me and look at me and go, "Man, you no worry, man. You get the bike back for you." And he would go off into the estate, and if it was a 10-speed bicycle, he'd have it back onto the, put the feeler, Michael needs your help. Get that thing back on the playground. And it was pretty cool, actually.
That is cool.
Yeah. Anyway, so, and then, like I said, I left and I was going to travel to the Americas for a year when I was 25. And then I ended up having a transformational experience. And I don't know how much else you want me to, maybe I should pause there if you have any questions.
Yeah. Well, I'm actually interested to hear what that transformational experience was.
Yeah, well, okay. So when I was in London, like I said, I was going to be traveling in the Americas for a year. And I met someone, story short, who introduced me to someone else who'd been on this self-realization seminar. In America at the time, you had a thing called EST, E-S-T. Mm-hmm. A lot of your listeners might remember EST, Werner Erhard. But this was something that was born in England, similar to EST. In fact, the guy that created it in England, Robert Daubeny, was the first guy that Werner Erhard asked to lead his seminars, his EST seminars. But he decided, Robert Daubeny was English, and he decided to do something in England instead. So the self-realization experience was amazing because it was a journey into reality, how we relate to our world in terms of how we feel, how we our emotions, how we think, and it was an opportunity to observe our feelings and thoughts, our opinions and beliefs. And at the end of that journey, over several days, you realize that you weren't actually your thoughts and feelings. You were actually the consciousness that was experiencing those thoughts and feelings, and that you have a body, and it's your vehicle, but it's not you. Mm-hmm. So in essence, that was what it was about. And so I had to this day, I'm grateful I had that experience, because the immediate effects were extraordinary. I mean, I was one of these guys that had to sleep a minimum of 8 hours every night. If I didn't get my 8 hours, I was like, I haven't had my 8 hours. After this experience of, it was called exegesis, the exegesis program. And I only needed 4 hours sleep a night for months. Wow, I had this extraordinary release of energy. I mean, the first thing I did, I got back to my basement apartment in London, in South London, and I looked around me and I saw all my plants were dying. I spent the next week after this seminar experience repotting, giving them haircuts, giving them fertilizer, bringing them back to life. And that's what I did for a whole week. My whole, I mean, everything was different. I saw things, the colors were different. My whole awareness and consciousness of everything around me was increased by a factor of God knows how many times. And the first thing I turned my attention to was plants in my apartment.
Interesting. So did that affect how you were thinking about what your purpose is here, or what you're supposed to be doing? Or
Yeah, I mean, it did. The main realization that I had in this seminar, apart from what I just told you, was at the very end when I went up in front of everyone and the facilitator, a lady called Kim, said, well, so what do you think you got out of this, and what are you going to take forward? And I was sort of going on about this and that. I can't even remember what, but she said, no, it's love. She said, for the first time in your life, really, you've been able to access love, to experience it, to receive it, and to give it. And so that was huge for me. And I was like, oh, of course, duh. Because prior to that experience, I really didn't know what a feeling was. You know, a typical guy, especially being brutalized in an English boarding school for all those 7 years. I mean, you know, I'd suppressed my feelings completely. I was traumatized. So, you know, and I had a lot of anger in me as well. I mean, how that feeling was stored up inside me, and it was etched on my face. And and I realized that what I wanted to do was to actually, in line with being an educator, I wanted to lead these seminars. And so actually I went on staff, and Robert said, you know, yeah, I mean, you can do it. And well, let's start. So I trained to actually to lead these seminars. So my purpose in life has always been education, and always to help raise the level of awareness in myself, consciousness, and in people in general, in the world. In the old days, though, it was grandiose. You know, I wanted to transform society like yesterday, and you know, I had visions of me being this kind of global, you know, wise guru, whatever. I mean, not really, but it was the ego part of it, the glamorous part of it, that really appealed to me. If I am perfectly honest with you, Kimberley, I mean, so I used to hang out in the 90s in a thing called the State of the World Forum, which was a whole week gathering world leaders in San Francisco for several years. And yeah, I was hanging out with Mikhail Gorbachev and heads of state and Deepak Chopra and all these people, and there was me. You know, I was hanging in there with them, having lunch with them, and getting to know people. And but yeah, that was 1995 through 2000, so that was a while back.
Was there anything surprising about any of these people that you met or talked to? Something, you know, you said, oh, I never would have known that seeing them on the TV, or, you know.
Yeah, I mean, Deepak Chopra was great. I mean, I actually met him in the corridor at one point between sessions, and I said, look, hey, I just want to tell you that I've got 3 heroes in life. I said, my heroes are Mikhail Gorbachev, Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones, and you. And he gave me this big hug, and we just had this fantastic hug. He was a really nice guy. The other person who really struck me as being amazing was Muhammad Yunus, who founded the Grameen Bank, who started the whole microcredit movement, which, if your listeners don't know anything about it, it's now, you know, as a movement, it's now all over the world. It doesn't get much publicity these days, but it's basically, his whole thing was starting out with it. He noticed women in Bangladesh, where he is from, they were in slavery debt to the middlemen who made profit from their baskets that they wove in the villages, but they were poor as anything, and they were, you know, really suffering in their hundreds of thousands. And so he said, I'm going to change the model here. I'm actually going to lend money on trust to these women, cut out the middlemen so they can actually make the baskets and have the profit from the baskets that they make. And he raised over 1 million people out of poverty in Bangladesh through this model. Quite an incredible guy, a lovely man, quite a saint really, a modern saint. And I ended up interviewing him for a book that my ex-girlfriend and I put together, that she wrote, that I sort of made possible. He was one of 10 corporate leaders, entrepreneurs who were featured in a book that we wrote called Cause for Success, which is back in 2004. And the whole idea there was to feature companies who are actually putting their social mission first and profit second. And as a result, actually being more successful commercially, but also at the same time, you know, making the world a better place. And he was a great example of that. So I interviewed him because I'd met him and hung out with him. I interviewed him a few years later on the phone and put him in one of the chapters. You know, we quoted him. But to answer your question again, was there anything surprising? Yes, ultimately, and it's a longer story than we've got time for here. But when I look back on it now, I realized that a lot of the people there were as corrupt as hell. You had, like, for example, one of the guest speakers was the CEO of Monsanto. And this is a long time ago. This is back in the late 90s. And you realize, of course, now in retrospect, what Monsanto is as an entity and how evil it is. There were other people there like David Rockefeller, the Rockefeller Foundation, who also is an evil entity as far as I'm concerned. And in fact, the sort of elements of what some people call the cabal were actually present in the State of the World Forum. I could list a whole bunch of people. I sat in on sessions with nuclear arms negotiators. People like, what's his name, that horrible American, he's a Brzezinski. And I didn't realize at the time that I was actually part of this mix of people who were in so many ways corrupt and have an evil propaganda, an evil sort of agenda, if you like. Anyway, and it ultimately came to nothing. There's some really good people there as well. Jane Goodall, for example, who has spent her life working with primates, you know, gorillas. There's a load of great people who were there too. But it was fascinating looking back, more so than at the time, to see who they were, who they are, and what those people have been involved in. Yeah,
yes. And I was just curious, why Mikhail Gorbachev? Why is he one of your heroes?
Because he managed to get to the top without being kind of sussed out, really. I mean, he got to the top and then he did the deed, which was basically dissolve the Soviet Union. So he was like a wolf in sheep's clothing, you know, because prior to him, all of those Soviet premiers like Khrushchev and all the rest of them, they were, you know, they were towing the party line. They were a product of the apparatus of the Communist Party. And Gorbachev miraculously made it to the top to be able to do what he did. And it's astonishing. And of course, you know, it was a very brave thing that he did. And even to this day, he's very unpopular with many Russians because of what happened as a result of him dissolving the Soviet Union, both in terms of national identity and then the impoverishment of Russia and all the rest of it. And of course, then you had Yeltsin after him, who was a drunkard and but then you got Putin, who had to restore order and pride to the nation. It's interesting. So that's why Gorbachev. And if you're going to ask me about Keith Richards, I just think he's a great example of an authentic human being. I love him to pieces, and the fact he survived. I mean, he's just so intelligent and so much fun. Amazingly enough, he's intelligent. In fact, his biography, his autobiography called Life, with a capital L, it's just called Life. Mm-hmm. And it's 500 pages and it's riveting. And it's even got a page of his recipe for shepherd's pie. That shepherd's pie was his favorite food. And the story goes, and you can read it in the book, that he used to get shepherd's pie delivered to him before every gig. And one time he got delivered the shepherd's pie, and he noticed that it was actually, someone had already started to eat it. It's obviously one of the roadies. And he went into a rage. He said, "Hey, look, tell Mick I'm not going on stage until I get another pie delivered to me, all right?" And the second shepherd's pie story is he's actually in his house in the country, and his son, I think it is, who's getting married. And they're all out, it's like 2 a.m, and it's a beautiful summer's night, and everyone's outside dancing in the grounds of this lovely house. And Keith decides, as he often did, to cook a shepherd's pie at 2 a.m. So he goes into this big kitchen, like he's putting it all together. And that's another thing. I mean, how the hell did he manage to keep it all together when he was like completely off his head on junk and all sorts of stuff and whiskey? But anyway, so he's putting it together, and he discovers that the spring onions, which are an essential ingredient of his pies, were missing. And again, he goes like, "Who's got my, I don't know if I can swear. Can I swear? Who's got my fucking spring onions?" Like, and he's like going absolutely steam coming out of his head. And his wife's there, and so is that famous model who's a friend of his, the English, I can't remember her name, you'd know it. So suddenly into the kitchen comes his son's best friend, and he's got a spring onion stuck in his ears like cigarette. You know, people put cigarettes in this. And Keith sees this guy. He says, "You got my fucking spring onions." And above the fireplace, there's these 2 swords. And he takes the swords and he runs after this guy into the woods.
Oh my gosh!
It's crazy. But yeah, Keith. So he's just authentic, you know, and he's an expert in 18th century naval history. Mm-hmm. Who would have thought? He's got this incredible library in this house in Connecticut where he lives, and he has to get on a step ladder to get to the top part of the library on this, because it's like wall to wall. And he's just an amazing character. In fact, I met, I'm probably going off on a tangent here, but I've got a Keith story, which is, I was going to Buenos Aires, and it was like 6 a.m. I was on the tarmac in JFK, and I'm sitting there in business class or first class or something. I'm sitting next to this woman, and she says, "Do you mind would you mind changing your seat so that my best friend can join me?" And like, you know, I'm not good in the morning. So I'm like being this real curmudgeon, and I'm like, you know, "Well, I mean, has your friend got an aisle seat? I'll change if she's got an aisle seat, but I only have an aisle seat. So I don't want to go into a regular seat in the middle." Anyway, so, and I hadn't had a coffee or something probably at that point. So eventually I agreed. All right. So this blonde woman came and sat next to the woman I'd been next to, who'd asked me to move, plus two sort of teenage girls. So I get down to my hotel in Buenos Aires, and it's the Royal Hyatt. And when I get there in the cab, I realize that the whole hotel is surrounded. On the outside railings, there's all these young men and women. What's going on here? And so I check in, I go up to my room, and I've got this room right at the front of the hotel overlooking the sort of grass lawn and all these young people. And it's got a little balcony. I open the doors and go out onto the balcony, and they all start cheering. And I go, "What's going on here? Why are they cheering me?" So I go downstairs. "Excuse me, who are these people, and why are they cheering me?" And they said, "Well, the Rolling Stones are staying here." And so I thought, "Oh, right, well, maybe they thought I was the manager or something." I was looking sort of business, you know, I had the business haircut and everything, because I was there on business. Anyway, that night I was down in the bar and I got talking to this guy who's half Scottish and half Zulu called Blondie. But Blondie's Keith Richards' best mate. He's in the band. And we struck up, we were talking for hours. He said, yeah, Keith and Mick and the families are staying at a ranch just 2 hours south of the city. Anyway, we meet the next night, Tuesday night, and we're hanging out, getting along great. And he said, do you want to come on Saturday night backstage? Because we're not playing the concert until Saturday night. I said, you know, I'd love to. He said, I could introduce you to the band and to Keith and Mick. I said, no, actually, I'm leaving on Friday. He said, oh, that's a shame. Okay, well. So then we meet on the next night, the Wednesday night, and he said, look, hey, Michael, tomorrow night, we're having a barbecue at the ranch. And, you know, it's a small little intimate thing. You know, Mick's going to be there, Keith's going to be there, and the family's going to be there. And I'd like to invite you down to, you know, to the barbecue. So I said, I can't. I'm running an executive workshop on Friday morning at 9 o'clock in the hotel. I don't think I'm going to be able to make it back from the ranch by 9 o'clock on Friday morning, thinking, yeah, drugs, rock and roll, you know, like God knows what. So I made a decision I couldn't do it. I couldn't flip burgers with Mick and Keith and all the rest of it. Anyway, so I made the decision. Everyone since then thinks I'm nuts. I said, well, I had integrity, because how would the client think, you know, for me just not turning up? Anyway, so the next morning, or actually the afternoon, after the workshop, I'm down in the lobby and there's Blondie. And he said, well, Michael, I want you to meet Keith's manager, Jane. And so he introduced me. I'm face to face with a woman that I've been horrible to on the plane at the beginning of the week in JFK. And she said, and I said, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I was such a horrible, cranky person. She said, oh, that's okay. And meet Keith's wife, Patty, and the kids. And the woman that I'd swapped seats with, oh dear, hang on a minute. The woman I'd swapped seats with was Keith's wife, and those were his kids. So my story is this: I met his manager, his wife, his kids, and his best friend. I didn't meet Keith.
Oh my
God. And I could have flipped burgers with him. Anyway, just one of those things.
Well, that was really a fun story.
That was great.
So I'm just curious with, you know, you seem to be, you know, very educated on what's going on in the world and the people in the world, and with everything changing and we're kind of in this transition right now, what's the best thing people can do to actually thrive in this situation?
Well, that's a great question. That's a huge question as well. I mean, I think that there's something practical that people can do. In fact, there's a couple of things that come to mind, and then there's also something that's that people can do internally. I think first, practically speaking, if you think or believe that you have information about what's really going on, not what you're led to believe is going on through the mainstream media, then I think it's your duty bound to share that information. So whether it's a video, it's an article from various, you know, from different people, some of them experts in their field, some of them not. But I think certainly in my case, I come across almost daily information that I believe is being suppressed or that people need to know about, that relate to the whole macro scenario of what's happening in the world with this virus and so on. And I feel it's my duty to share that information so that people have a chance to read and listen to stuff that they wouldn't normally get a chance to do, like my 87-year-old mother, like my partner Karin, people who normally would go, oh, that's just crazy conspiracy theory rubbish, or have not even considered it because they don't get access to independent media. All they get is the BBC, certainly in this country. And the BBC is a big propaganda machine, in my book. So sharing information is really important, especially at a time when, excuse me, when the many people are being deleted and deplatformed from YouTube, Facebook, and censored.
Mm-hmm.
And then you question freedom, what's happened to freedom of speech? What is happening to freedom of speech? So that's one thing you can do, is to share information. You have to stay relatively humble, and you have to be aware of the danger of not thinking that you're right all the time, because you may be wrong. Mm-hmm. You may be actually sharing information that could actually be, disinformation, or at least not factual. So there is that risk, and I think you have to be continuously censoring yourself, or not censoring, but monitoring yourself, to make sure that you don't assume too much and presume too much and come across as a know-it-all, and also therefore lay yourself open to criticism of being arrogant or alienating people, so they won't be able to hear the information you want to share, because that's always a danger. I mean, if you're going to put stuff out there that is threatening to people because it's an alternative narrative, then it's easy to trigger them into further alienation from what you're saying and resistance. So you've got to be very, very careful, and that's an inner coaching process where you have to be vigilant all the time. So that's sort of the caveat about sharing information. The other thing is that you can do is to facilitate open conversation, discussion, dialogue. Because what I find at the moment is more and more, and social media is what I call the soundbite world. Easy to get sucked into them and us. Easy to get sucked into well, you're wrong. I can show you, I've got evidence that what you're saying is completely bonkers. And again, you've got barriers that exist that don't have to be there, because the whole point, I think, of what we're going through at the moment is to transcend the them and us scenario. The whole point is to have freedom of speech, free minds, and to, within that, respect people's opinions, genuinely respect diversity. It's not happening at the moment. Mm-hmm. Officially, with governments, they're treating us like kids for the most part. They're not allowing us to have choice. They're basically telling us what we should do. It's taking away people's freedom of choice, of responsibility, and so on. But within all of that, it's important to give you an example. So what I do, if I find that someone is, and I was just on a call before I came into this interview, mm-hmm. with a bunch of people called in the Speak Out Academy, and these are whistleblowers. And so the whole call was with people who are concerned, either whistleblowing, who've been the victims of persecution from whistleblowing. But there was this guy who was the founder of the organization from America, who was going on about how the lockdown should continue and go further, and it's terrible. And he's a doctor, and I thought, and I was so nervous, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to be brave here. I'm actually going to say what my experience is, that the numbers have been completely manipulated, and I've got first-hand experience because I've been in the hospital locally twice in the last 4 weeks. I've talked to the nurses and the doctors, so I know what's really going on, at least in that big hospital. Mm-hmm. But again, it's when I was in that hospital, and some of the medical staff were sort of coming out with the standard, well, you should wear the mask. And I'm going, well, no, actually, I don't think it's a good idea. I think it's unhealthy to wear the mask. And I actually am not afraid at all, and I blah, 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 blah. And if you get a hardline medical staff member going, well, it doesn't work for me to go, well, I think you're wrong. You obviously don't know what you're talking about. I know you're a nurse or you're a doctor, but you haven't, all you hear is from the BBC and you hear from Fauci and people like that. That doesn't work because you're simply putting them on the defensive. And again, if we're going to have a new world, a transformed world, and not one that's increasingly totalitarian, we have to individually do our best to facilitate respectful conversation. Even if people's views are diametrically opposed to our own, doesn't matter. What's more important are values of listening and empathy and compassion and understanding. And I'm not just trotting those words out. We need to have those kind of values in action in ourselves and in others, and we need to facilitate those in others so that we can transcend this fear-based polarization. So that's the second thing. So the first thing I'm suggesting is sharing information. The second is actually facilitating genuine, open, respectful dialogue. The third thing, to answer your question, is that ultimately, if you can step back far enough and see everything in terms of life, death, and our existence as consciousness within the whole universe, then we have to, I think, do the work internally in ourselves to be true to ourselves and know that whatever happens out there and happens to us as a result of what's happening, and even if we do get put in prison, or even if we do get ostracized, or we don't agree to being chipped so we're out on a limb, even if that's a worst case scenario, and I hope it doesn't come to that. I don't think it will, because I have faith that if we are doing the inner work, we shouldn't underestimate that ultimately, if we stay with the power of love, and if we stay with authenticity, being authentic, then miracles can happen. And society can literally shift. I'm on my own here in a sense, so that's my responsibility, and it's yours. Anyone individually, is their responsibility to do this, but collectively, if that's our work, if you like, work, then we can really create an amazing world, which we should be having now already, with cures for viruses, with cures for cancers that exist already, with technology that allows us to have free energy and all the rest of it. Yes. It's there.
Yes.
To answer your question.
Yes, you did. And we're just thinking, as we are actually going inward and finding, for me, it's finding that peaceful place where there's joy, where there's peace, no matter what's happening outside, can always go into that place and find that place. And I think that's really important. I also think it's important that we be unified with people. We all really need each other now, because we're feeling so isolated, so alone, really. A lot of people are feeling very alone, especially if they live alone.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, people talk about, okay, so my philosophy is also this, and I have a podcast series called From Crisis to Heroic Journeys from Crisis to Transformation. It's based on it was prompted by my own experiences of going from crisis to transformation. And the fact that I believe that in no matter how bad it gets, there's always something positive to be gained. There's always a silver lining. There's always something, even if you can't see it at the time, but something will evolve from that crisis or catastrophe or bad times that will be better, if you like, for want of a better word. And so what I've noticed is, the thing that I'm going into the lockdown, I was like, oh God, I was so depressed. And I thought, well, what's the opportunity here? What is the upside of this? And there have been amazing upsides, at least for me personally. But also I've seen that the community, that people being in community and the kindness people show to each other, this is what, if we recognize it, I think what I would like to see is that taken forward into this better world, into this new world that is not about lockdowns and governmental dictatorship, but it's a world in which people really are empowered, and that people recognize that we can all help each other, and we don't have to live in fear. And that's one of the great things that, I mean, even in my village where I live, it's been really wonderful, the care and concern that people have for each other. I've never been connected with my own village before, but we now have a chat thing, and there's all kinds of generosity going on. I mean, amazing generosity. So, yeah, that's oneness,
Yeah.
But
Yeah, beautiful. It just warms my heart just thinking about that. And I have noticed that in my community too, people reaching out to each other, helping each other, and it's just amazing people's hearts. So,
yeah.
but you've mentioned your podcast and some different things. Why don't you tell people where they can find you, what podcasts you have, what services you have, so they can connect with you?
Sure. Okay, so my baby is Heroic Journeys from Crisis to Transformation, and that can be found. And funnily enough, although I've got about published about 10 or 11 episodes, and I've got another 5 or 6 that I haven't published yet. Even I haven't actually, even though it's been going for a while, I haven't launched it yet. I'm about to launch it big time. When I say that, I mean I'm going to start having subscriptions for free. I mean, nothing to be paid. The reason that I have the guests, the men and women I have on the show, is because they've all in their own ways been through difficult times. And as a result have become better, happier, wiser people who have a lot of advice to give, to share, and can inspire people who are in the middle of all this darkness or about to go into it. And it could be midlife crisis, it could be, losing a job, it could be divorce, could be cancer, it could be all kinds of stuff where you really hit the proverbial. And people don't have a roadmap for that, so it really helps to hear from other people who've already gone down that road and can give advice and inspiration, encouragement. So those are my guests. You can find, if you Google Heroic Journeys from Crisis to Transformation, Michael Banks, you can find it on Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Anchor. There's about 8 different platforms, but it's easy to find. iTunes, it's all there. So that's the one that is my baby, and that's the one that I really want to launch properly, so that more people get a chance to hear the stuff. I don't know if your audience is how international it is, but a lot of my guests actually either live or are, from America or are American. Largely because I think also I've, lived there for so long myself. But that's that podcast series, and I also have a business one called Leadership Luminaries, which I recently launched, which I produce and host, and that's under the umbrella or under the flag of a company called People Smart that I do work with, and I'm friends with the CEO and founder there. And I said, look, Chris, I've got this idea for a business podcast. So I interview some like corporate leaders and thinkers and progressive people around matters related to, corporations, organizations, and so on. So yeah, that's basically how you can find me. I think I've given you the right. I mean, I've got an email address. Do you want me to?
Sure. Yeah.
The the email address to contact me is michaelbanks7. That's MICHAELBANKS. I say to people, Michael Banks, as in river, money, Gordon Banks, the famous English goalkeeper when we won the World Cup in 1966, and Mary Poppins, who were two kids, Jane and Michael Banks. A lot of people still remember, still see the Mary Poppins movie.
Yeah.
So Michael Banks 7, so it's Michael Banks and then the number 7 at gmail.com. Very simple. I also have a book out that I wrote about my kidney story called Got a Kidney. The English don't like it very much. They think it's very Americanized to say G-O-T-T-A, got a kidney. So the website is www.gotakidney, one word, .com. Got a kidney, sorry, and it's .com, but it's the book itself has got a question mark and an exclamation mark after kidney. In other words, have you got one? Because I needed a new kidney. I had to have a kidney because otherwise I was dead. And also, got a kidney! Exclamation mark, because I got one from my partner Karin 6 years ago, which is, so the book is the story of those years. Yeah, so that's my information.
Wonderful. So before we end today, what is your best advice on living the most incredible, extraordinary life?
You know, it sounds awfully, maybe it comes across as being a bit like either, I'm not going to say how I mean, I'll tell you, it's based on my own life. I've had an amazing life. I really have. I'm so grateful. I've had an incredible life and I continue to do so. In fact, my life now is probably more amazing than it ever was. But for me, it has been my lifelong journey to become fully authentic. Because in being authentic, there is freedom. You don't care, in the best sense, you don't care what people think about you. You're free to express yourself fully, whether it's your sadness, your anger. I mean, there is also a need to be skillful about it. You can't just, authenticity is not going into a room if you're angry and just being angry. That's not very responsible in my book. But authenticity, you feel great in yourself. You have to feel so good because you're being yourself. You're not being the person that you think other people want you to be, or your teachers or parents or friends or the government want you to be. You're yourself. So there's an amazing freedom in that, being authentic. And it's exciting. I mean, authentic, I just wrote an article, I also write. So I wrote an article called Skillful Authenticity. And it's about when you're around someone who is authentic, especially a leader, you know, it's life-giving. They're inspiring. These people are alive, and therefore you feel alive around them because they are truly being themselves. They're not holding back. They're not centering. They're only holding back in terms of being considerate of other people, which is different from holding back because they're scared or because they've been repressed in some way, you know, whether it's childhood or the other day. So yeah, I mean, to answer the question, Kimberley, it's really the key to my mind. Maybe it's not quite as simple as that, but the main thing is authenticity. Become fully authentic, and everything else will flow from that. Your compassion, your empathy, your love, your kindness. You know, I've got 4 values in life: love, kindness, authenticity, and freedom. If you've got those 4 going on and you genuinely embody them and experience them, then I think you have an amazing life.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much. And thank you for all the sharing you've done and your stories. You have great stories. So thank you so much for sharing and inspiring us. And we'll talk to you again soon.
Well, thank you, Kimberley. And thanks for giving me the opportunity to share all of this stuff. You've been wonderful. Thank you. Thanks a lot.